Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev. Today we're continuing to work on our clone of a Vlambeer game that hasn't even been released yet. The last time we fixed a few errors made in the episode prior, then we added the gestation system to the game, aka the gray goo phase of the enemy spawns. And we also worked on a system to get said eggs to spawn properly in the world. And today we're adding the last few bells and whistles to the project. That's right, we'll be adding a number of visual effects to our clone, as well as tweaks to better mirror the original prototype, and add a few remaining systems and mechanics. So let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. Now between videos I added prettier graphics to the project. I went with a dog theme, but then I realized the end result was their faces exploding. So I tried to make them look like ugly dogs, to lessen the dark reality. I also added a few new graphics we'll be implementing later in the session. Now the first thing we had to do was fix the quote-unquote suck effect added last episode, which currently doesn't work properly. After a bunch of code tweaks, I realized what the issue was. Not only did the air effect have no collision, but I also wasn't defining a proper direction for the air to flow. Thus, it would just spawn and disappear immediately. Next, I added some screen shake to the purple explosion. This is the same code that we've been using in multiple projects for anyone keeping track. I should also take this moment to point out the visual changes to the explosions, and the overall camera is much more zoomed in, all of this to better mirror the prototype. Speaking of which, next up was the edge effect for the border of the level. Now looking at IGN's footage, I'm pretty sure surfaces were used to achieve this effect, but given my setup was pretty discounted as is, I went with a more simple option. I would have pieces of the border fade in as the player gets near them, and fade out when the player is far enough away. And with that, we were one step closer to looking even more like the prototype. But we're not done with the visual tweaks just yet. We had to ditch this checkered background. Unfortunately, I forgot to draw a background, so I took a moment to doodle something quickly in GameMaker itself. And I have to say, it wasn't all that bad for just a couple of minutes of work. So with our game looking so fine, it was finally time to take the training wheels off our player character. Using a simple variable, I had the player keep track of the nearest enemy and had the ship face in its direction. Judging from the footage, this seems to be how Vlambeer did it, so I left it at that. Next, I added a gooey explosion effect to the enemy deaths. It's a simple little explosion graphic using an animation object specifically meant for cosmetic effects. And it may not be very obvious in the chaos, but it sure beats the disappearing act of Ode. I then spent some time tweaking the enemies, mostly varying their attack timing, basically trying to tone down the bullet spam to better reflect the prototype. An exploding animation was also added to the homing bullets, much like seen in the prototype. And now it was time to make our player mortal. I realized at this point that I did not account for the player dying, and so there were so many checks for the player that if the player were to be destroyed, it would break the entire game. So instead, since this was a one-hit death type of game, I simply turned the player's sprite invisible and disabled player control on death. Then for most projectiles, I turned off collision if the player was no longer alive. And to make things more dramatic, I added more explosions, both in the form of a sprite and the circular explosions used in the purple enemy, and obviously topped it off with a good bit of dramatic screen shake. But before we could bask in the beautiful death effects, we had more code to add. Namely keeping track of the score. Using a global variable, I gave enemy death points, 1 point for eggs, 5 for normal enemies, and 10 for bosses. I then had to record that number, and to do like the prototype did required a ton of extra coding, because I'm not sure if it can actually be done better any other way. And to make a long bit short, in order to save space, I used an array to determine the score's positioning. Top left when the player is alive, middle of the screen when dead. And to say the end result wasn't pretty would be an understatement, but sometimes ugly is the only way to go. Then again, what might be ugly under the hood looks oh so pretty on the surface. At this point, you could say we made a pretty dang good clone of Vlambeer's prototype. I was almost ready to call it a day when I realized I was still getting points after dying. After some poking around, I realized that eggs were giving points when transitioning from egg to enemy, and so I had to add a check that determined whether an egg was being destroyed because it was shot by the player or because it was spawning an enemy. So now, finally, with that taken care of, our prototype clone was pretty much complete. It's not an exact one-to-one copy, but given this was built from scratch based on nothing but a 4-minute video from IGN, I think we did pretty well all things considered. And I know I hinted at doing more with the extra code we accidentally wrote, but for now I think we'll leave the project as is. We could continue to morph this into something more original, but I want to respect Vlambier's work. This was more of an experiment and a personal test, and I'm pretty satisfied with the results, so hopefully you are too. So this is where this mini-series and this episode of Let's Dev comes to an end. So remember that if you like this video or enjoy Let's Dev in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on our clone in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.